This happened back in 2020. With the world going into lockdown because of COVID, everyone was stuck at home, trying to adjust. I, on the other hand, used the whole situation as an excuse to do something I loved: travel. I'm a big fan of backpacking and camping, so I spent the time exploring national parks, camping in different spots. One of those places was a creek in Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. To give some context, back in 2019, something went wrong with my job, and as a result, my reputation took a hit. A lot of people weren't too fond of me after that. I had to change apartments, get a new phone number, and eventually quit my job. My mistake had caused some people to lose a lot of money, so the backlash was expected. But I didn't anticipate just how far it would go. For months, I was getting harassed by random numbers. Some of the texts were even threatening. I never knew if it was the same person or multiple people, but there was a chance it was just one person texting me from different numbers. After a while, things seemed to quiet down, and I thought maybe people had moved on or lost interest. At that point, I wasn't working anymore and was focusing on myself, which was why I took to traveling. I drove 3 hours to Rocky Mountain National Park, parked my truck, and set off on a hike up the trail to the creek. The place was completely empty, which made sense since this was right when the lockdown started, and people were taking it seriously. Plus, it was still winter, so there was a thin layer of snow on the ground that made a loud crunch with every step. When I finally made it to the creek, it was still flowing. Thankfully, not frozen. The place was peaceful, just what I needed to clear my head. I found a spot off the trail to set up camp, chopped some wood, got a fire going, and cooked sausages on the stove. After eating, I started reading a book by the fire. The sun was setting by the time I finished a few chapters, and I was thankful for my headlamp. As I smoked a joint, enjoying the peace, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I don't get many messages apart from family, so I pulled it out, and my heart dropped. There were a bunch of texts from an unknown number. The messages were unsettling. One said, "How's your camping going, buddy?" The next one, "It's beautiful out here." And then, "I see why you came up here." I immediately felt uneasy. I mean, if it was a family member, I might have brushed it off, but the messages made it seem like someone was with me, not just asking how the camping was going. Being high didn't help my anxiety at all. I felt paranoid, scanning the woods around me, getting up and doing a full 360-degree look. My hand instinctively went to my P365 handgun in my bag, just for peace of mind. Normally, I'd put out the fire before going to bed, but I didn't want to be left in complete darkness. So I crawled into my tent, laid down, and just stared at my phone, waiting for a response. Minutes dragged on. I still had my headlamp on, trying to read, but the combination of being high and the texts made it impossible to focus. Instead, I decided to watch some YouTube videos to pass the time. I wasn't ready to sleep yet, not with the situation bothering me so much. I got absorbed in a true crime documentary. I know, probably not the best choice considering where I was. When, just as I least expected it, another text came through. "Doesn't matter anymore." My heart started racing all over again. I responded, "How did you know I'm camping?" But no reply came. I kept questioning myself. Was this just a prank? A joke from a friend or family member? Or was this one of those people who'd been harassing me? But if it was the latter, how could they possibly know I was camping here? That's what made it feel so wrong. Time seemed to drag on as I tried to shake off my anxiety, watching more videos. The fire outside was dying down, and the woods became eerily silent, as they do in winter when there's no sound of insects. The second a video ended, the silence felt deafening. Then it happened. I heard footsteps crunching in the snow. Someone was approaching my tent. I froze. The footsteps stopped just a few feet from the tent. My grip tightened on the gun. Suddenly, there was a flash. Someone shone a flashlight on my tent, or maybe they took a picture. Then the footsteps started to fade away, and my phone dinged. I looked at the screen. It was a photo of my tent with the message, "Have a good night's sleep." A chill ran down my spine. In that moment, everything clicked. My heart was pounding, but something inside me snapped. I had to do something. I unzipped the tent, grabbed the gun, and fired 2 shots into the air. The sound of feet running away in the snow was enough to tell me that my little show of force worked. But I also realized that whoever it was still out there, watching me. I yelled something into the air, half out of fear, half out of instinct, before crawling back into the tent. The footsteps stopped, and the texts stopped. The silence was almost too much, but eventually, I fell asleep, still on edge. When the sun came up, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Whoever had been harassing me and apparently stalking me backed off after they realized I wasn't just some easy target. I don't look like someone who would own a gun, and maybe that's why they thought I was an easy mark. I didn't shoot the gun out of some tough guy impulse. I did it because I genuinely felt like I had no choice. 5 years later, I haven't heard from them again. That night was terrifying, but looking back, I can't help but wonder how differently it could have gone if I hadn't been armed. Every year when I was a kid, my family would go up to northern Michigan for a weekend in October. My Uncle Jim had a 4-acre property there with a big house that could easily fit everyone. It had 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, plenty of space for my parents, my siblings, and my cousins. The way the rooms were divided was simple. My brother and sister shared one room, and my 4 cousins shared another. The rest of the house was for the adults. Uncle Jim was always into hunting and fishing. He would go on hunting trips all over the country, camping out in the wild for days at a time. My dad went with him a few times, even though he's more of an animal lover and would never hurt anything. Part of Uncle Jim's property was wooded, and he had marked the property line with red paint on a line of trees. Beyond that was county-owned land, I think. The nearest house in that direction was probably miles away. One afternoon, while the adults were talking about hunting, my brother Adam, my cousins Jake and Joe, and I came up with the idea to camp out in the woods that night. Our dads, who were already a bit tipsy, thought it was a great idea and said yes without hesitation. Our moms weren't thrilled about it, but they didn't exactly forbid us either. So, with a little bit of excitement and a little bit of alcohol in the air, my dad and Uncle Jim took us into the woods with a tent. It was just the boys. My sister and my girl cousins didn't want in on this adventure. At the time, I was 13, Adam was 10, Jake was around 10, and Joe was the youngest at 9. We hiked out to a small clearing in the woods, which my uncle had pointed out earlier. He said the area, covered in soft moss, was perfect for camping. He even mentioned that he'd used it before. Our dads gave us a half-drunk lesson on how to set up the tent. They made sure we helped, so it wasn't just them doing all the work. The tent was big enough to fit all 4 of us. We got it set up in the daytime, which was way easier than trying to do it in the dark. Once it was done, we went back to the house and played outside until dinner. During dinner, our moms once again voiced their concerns. They thought we were too young to be out in the woods alone, but our dads insisted we'd be fine. I remember my dad joking that we'd be close enough for them to hear our screams if something went wrong. Eventually, after the sun went down, we headed back into the woods, all of us carrying flashlights and extra blankets to stay warm. I even brought a deck of Uno cards for some fun. When we got to the tent and got settled in, our dad said goodnight and headed back to the house. It was just us now, alone in the woods. Honestly, we were farther out than I'd expected. Far enough that we couldn't see any lights from the house. We started playing Uno to pass the time. After about half an hour, everything was great. Until we heard it. A scream. It sounded like a woman or a girl, and it was coming from somewhere in the woods. We all froze, staring at each other. I remembered that foxes sometimes make noises that sound like a woman's scream, so I told the others that it was probably just that. Joe, the youngest, looked freaked out, but my explanation seemed to calm everyone down. We went back to our game. But then, it happened again. This time, the scream was louder and much closer. It didn't sound like a fox at all. It sounded more human. We went silent again, this time with a feeling of unease creeping in. Joe looked like he was about to cry, so I told everyone to turn off their flashlights. We huddled in the darkness, all of us whispering about what it could be. I didn't know, but I hoped it was just an animal. Then, out of nowhere, we heard footsteps, crunching through the leaves. Fast footsteps getting closer. They stopped, and then we heard it. A blood-curdling, gut-wrenching scream, this time right outside the tent. And then the tent started shaking. That's when all hell broke loose. We all screamed, terrified, but we didn't know what to do. Jake and Joe were panicking, while my brother and I yelled at them to get out of the tent. I unzipped the door, and one by one, we bolted out into the woods. We had our flashlights on, shining them everywhere as we ran, our only light in the complete darkness. The run back to the house felt like a life or death moment. Every second, I thought something was right behind us. We made it back to the property, screaming the whole way. My parents and Uncle Jim were already outside, worried and asking what happened. We explained about the screams and the shaking tent. They were just as horrified as we were. But then, something strange happened. I noticed my sister and cousins Jamie and Christina weren't outside. I called out to my dad and uncle, asking if they had sent one of the girls to scare us. But when they showed us that the girls were already in bed, it hit us. Someone else was out there. Someone we didn't know. My dad and Uncle Jim grabbed rifles and went back out into the woods to search. They came back after a while, saying they couldn't find anyone. The next morning, we packed up the tent and all the gear and brought it back to the house. And that was the last time we ever camped out in those woods. Heck, we didn't even play outside after dark anymore. That night still sticks with me. I can't say for sure who was out there, but I don't think any of us will ever forget that feeling of being watched and hearing those screams so close to us.